Fairwater, Carolina. The year the Union trembled, the year the South cloaked itself in drums and banners. While soldiers drilled in town squares and the first whispers of secession turned into shouts, the plantation class of Carolina gathered not for war, but for spectacle. That March at the Hartfield estate, Judge Richard Hart opened his doors to the grandest charity ball Fairwater had ever seen. They called it an offering to the needy widows of the county, but in truth, it was an exhibition of wealth, silk, and power, an orchestra of hierarchy, with every note played upon the backs of those in chains. The Hartfield estate stood like a fortress of order, white columns glaring against the pine-dark sky. Inside, chandeliers bled their golden light onto polished floors, every crystal drop catching the motion of gowns and boots. Fiddles and violins filled the air, mingling with the smell of roasted game, hot wax, tobacco smoke, and the perfume of magnolia oil dabbed behind pale ears. Charleston merchants, Beaufort planters, military officers in dress coats, every seat of power in the region gathered beneath one roof. At the center of it all, Eva Hart, 22 years old, heiress to the estate, porcelain-skinned and practiced in charm. Pearls clasped her neck, white gloves hid the tremor of a hand too tightly bound by duty. Beside her stood Walter Reed, her fiancé, a man born to inheritance, not labor. His waistcoat glittered with imported buttons, his hair shone slick with pomade. His pride was his perfume, his vanity his weapon. He laughed louder than the fiddles, clapped harder than the music required, and in every gesture revealed the cruelty of a boy taught that the world was his stage. Judge Hart watched from the dais, his heavy face carved from law itself, lips thin as the lines of his ledgers. He was Fairwater's magistrate, arbiter of discipline both in court and on his own lands. His rule was said to be stern, never cruel, but cruelty delegated is cruelty multiplied. And so the lash, the collar, and the stocks spoke his justice louder than any gavel. Moving among them, unseen yet essential, were the enslaved. Trays carried by trembling hands, wine poured with downcast eyes. The orchestra tuned by men whose names would never be announced. Among them walked Daniel Walker. Daniel was 29. Son of a mother sold before memory, father unknown. His hands were carved by fire and iron. He was Fairwater's blacksmith, its carpenter, its silent architect. Nails, hinges, cartwheels, locks. His labor framed every corner of the estate, though his name never signed a deed. He was rare among the enslaved, for he carried two gifts, strength and literacy. Years ago, a Quaker peddler, reckless in kindness, had taught him letters under the guise of scripture. Daniel had read scraps since Bibles, almanacs. A newspaper blown from town words he kept folded deep in his mind like a second tongue. He was quiet, broad-shouldered, eyes steady. The forge had built him from smoke and silence. That night he was summoned not for music nor carpentry, but for service. The overseer, Cole, had ordered it, Cole, whose whip was law in the yards, whose voice carried like iron through the quarters. Daniel was to bring in a crate of wine, carried from the cellar to the ballroom floor. Nothing more, nothing less. He entered the hall, carrying the wooden crate against his chest, shoulders gleaming with sweat from the furnace. The laughter dimmed for just a moment as some turned to look not at him, but at the spectacle of labor crossing their polished world. His boots left faint marks on the marble, dust from the cellar mixing with candlelight. Walter Reed noticed him first. The young master's grin sharpened as he leaned toward Eva. Words passed between them, soft enough for secrecy, cruel enough to make her lips curve. Walter raised his voice. Clumsy. Daniel froze, though he had spilled nothing. The crate lay balanced in his arms, still, steady. Yet the word clung to the air, waiting. Clumsy, Walter repeated, louder this time, so that nearby guests turned. Look at him. eyes like a mule. Surely he ought to be taught grace before he carries wine before ladies. A ripple of laughter followed, low, polite, venomous. Daniel's jaw tightened, but his gaze did not rise. He shifted the crate slightly in his arms, preparing to continue. Walter stepped closer, eyes bright with cruelty. "Kneel," he said. "If you cannot walk with grace, then you will kneel with humility." Daniel looked up once. The chandeliers cut their light across his face, shadows deepening the scar at his temple, a mark from years earlier when a cart axle had splintered beneath his hammer. His eyes met Eva's. For a moment, something flickered there. Not pity, not mercy, but unease. Then her hand fluttered like a fan, urging him down. Judge Hart did not move from his seat. Overseer Cole watched from the doorway, lips curled in approval. Brother Amos, the pastor invited to bless the feast, murmured about discipline being God's order. No one spoke against it, so Daniel lowered himself. Slowly, deliberately, he bent his knees until the weight of the crate pressed him down onto the marble floor. He balanced it before him like an offering. The hall erupted laughter, clapping, the scrape of chairs as men leaned forward to see better. A fiddler faltered in his tune, then struck the strings harder, covering the moment with a reel. Ava's cheeks flushed, though whether with triumph or shame none could say. Walter grinned, basking in the cruelty. Guests whispered to one another about order, about obedience, about how even the proudest slave could be bent like reed to wind. And Daniel Walker, blacksmith of Fairwater, knelt on marble beneath the chandeliers. His sweat dripped onto the polished stone, leaving marks that would fade by morning. His back remained straight, his gaze lowered. He spoke no word. But something settled inside him that night. Not fury, not yet. Something smaller, denser, hotter. Like a coal buried deep in the forge, waiting for air. It did not flare in that moment, nor the next. It smoldered. Invisible to the crowd, invisible even to himself. The fiddles played on. The overseer turned away. The judge resumed his wine. Eva smiled at Walter, though her hands trembled in her gloves, and Daniel rose, lifted the crate once more, and walked quietly from the hall, leaving behind laughter that rang harsher than the crack of iron on stone. Outside, the night air smelled of salt marsh and smoke from the forges. Stars blinked faintly above the pines. Daniel walked back toward the cellar, footsteps heavy but measured. Each breath carried the taste of humiliation, sharp as rust, bitter as ash. He thought of the letters he kept folded in his mind, the words he had read in stolen scraps of paper. Dignity, liberty, justice. They sounded distant now, almost mocking, yet the coal inside him burned on. The laughter of that night did not end with the music. It echoed into the mornings. It followed Daniel into the forge, into the yard, into the silence of the slave quarters. Once a craftsman, whom even white men begrudgingly respected for his scowl with iron, he became something else in the weeks that followed. An example. Overseer Cole saw to that. Cole was a man carved from meanness, his frame wiry, his face shadowed by a permanent sneer. He ruled the estate yard like a captain of punishment, quick with the whip, inventive in cruelty, eager to display power through spectacle. When word of the ballroom humiliation spread among the quarters, Cole made certain the story did not fade. The first task was boots. Walter Reed, swollen with the memory of that evening's triumph, summoned Daniel to the veranda. The sun beat hot on the white columns, and the guests of the house lounged with cigars in hand, their laughter spilling into the yard. Walter stretched his legs, fine leather boots crossed before him, and barked, "On your knees again, Walker, shine them." So in full view of the house servants, Daniel bent low. He rubbed the black polish into the leather with cloth and rag, the scent of grease filling his nostrils. The overseer stood nearby, arms folded, smirking. The laughter of the guests rose like birds startled into flight. Daniel said nothing, his jaw tight, his back straight. He worked until Walter's reflection shone clear enough for vanity. That night in the quarters, the whispers grew sharper. Children giggled at the tale, not from malice, but from the cruelty of repetition. Men avoided Daniel's gaze, ashamed to share his shame. Women looked at him with eyes both pitying and frightened, as if humiliation might be contagious. Daniel sat alone by the forge embers, the polish still staining his hands, his silence deeper than the night. The next blow came in the market. Daniel had been sent to fetch nails and oil, carrying a small pouch of coins. The day was heavy with dust, stalls loud with barter, and the cry of gulls from the riverfront. As he reached for the iron nails, a merchant's voice cut sharp, "Thief!" The pouch was missing. Cole appeared as though conjured, his eyes narrow, his voice triumphant. "Caught with sticky fingers, Walker," he sneered. Daniel searched the ground, the cart, his pockets nothing. The pouch was gone, as if the air had swallowed it. The merchant's son smirked from behind the stall, his hand suspiciously quick to tuck something away. Daniel protested, but no one listened. The overseer dragged him by the collar back to the estate. That afternoon, under the wide gaze of the plantation, Daniel was tied to the whipping post. The sun glared down, the cicadas screamed, and the leather bit into flesh with each lash. He did not cry out. Not once, but the sound of the whip cracked across the quarters, sinking into memory. And when the punishment was done, Cole brought out a board, rough-hewn pine, heavy, with crude letters carved deep. "Liar." He slung it around Daniel's neck with a rope, forcing him to carry it as he walked through the estate yard. The slaves paused in their labors, eyes flicking up to see him pass. Some looked away quickly, others stared with hollow sympathy. Children pointed, then hushed when their mothers pulled them close. Daniel walked the length of the yard with the word cutting into his chest, not from splinters, but from shame. His hands, the same that forged iron, now hung at his sides, powerless. Each step was a drumbeat of humiliation. He walked until the overseer grew bored, until the sun began to sink. Only then was the board removed. At night, Daniel sat by the dying embers, the letters of the board burning into his mind. Liar. Yet he knew the truth. It was not theft, but theater. Cole had staged it. Walter had enjoyed it. Judge Hart had sanctioned it by silence. He was no longer merely a craftsman. They had made him a symbol of scorn. But while Daniel was being ground down, another story began to crack the estate's carefully polished order. It started in the pews of Sunday service. Brother Amos thundered from the pulpit, his voice oily with scripture, warning of disobedience and sin. The white families sat in polished rows. The enslaved stood at the back, heads lowered. Ava Hart sat in the front row, pale as the altar cloth, her handkerchief trembling in her hand. She swayed once, twice, then gripped the pew to steady herself. Whispers fluttered among the women, fainting was unbecoming of a bride. The midwife, an old enslaved woman who had caught countless children in the shadows of the quarters, leaned toward another servant and whispered, "Not faint. Expecting." The word slipped like smoke. Expecting. And too soon, too near. By the following week, the whispers had grown into murmurs. The dates did not align. The wedding had not yet come. If Ava Hart carried a child, then its father could not be Walter Reed. At first, the judge dismissed it as gossip, but the evidence showed itself in Ava's trembling hands, her sudden silences, the way she withdrew from dances and meals. The overseer heard the rumors first from the servants. He relished them, feeding them like fire. Walter Reed heard them next, his pride burning hotter than jealousy. Soon even the guests of the estate began to mock in private. Hart's daughter is with child, but whose? Daniel heard the whispers in the forge. He worked the iron as if deaf, but each strike of the hammer seemed to echo the murmur of his name, though none dared speak it aloud. A silence grew around him, heavier than chains. The degradation of Daniel Walker had become a sport, but the scandal of Eva Hart was about to make it dangerous. By summer's height, the air in Fairwater was thick, not only with heat, but with rumor. The scandal of Eva Hart swelled like a bruise that could not be hidden beneath silk. At teas in Charleston parlors, at courthouse steps, at the benches outside the apothecary, whispers tangled. The judge's daughter carried a child, and the arithmetic of months did not match the timing of her engagement. At first, Judge Hart moved as though nothing had changed. He presided over trials with his heavy gavel, rode his estate with cold authority, sat at the head of his table in silence. But behind his shutters, plans were drawn. Scandal, if left unchecked, could topple a dynasty. His solution was swift, brutal, and invisible. Erase Daniel Walker, silence Eva, repair the illusion. The overseer carried the message first, with relish in his voice. There will be a hearing. Not in court, not with jury, but in the estate's great hall. No record, no minutes, only verdict. The judge called it extrajudicial necessity. Daniel Walker was to be sold downriver, further south, to plantations where men disappeared into cane and fever, where no whisper could ever follow. Eva would be married quickly, whisked to her aunt's house in Charleston, her child presented to the world as Walter Reed's lawful heir. Brother Amos thundered the plan into scripture the next Sunday. From the pulpit, he warned of Eve's disobedience and the dangers of temptation, shaping Eva's plight into a parable. He called on women to obey, on men to preserve order, on slaves to submit. His sermon was less prayer than decree, and the congregation nodded, eager to believe that scandal could be baptized into silence. But the cracks widened. Eva, pale and trembling, sat rigid in her pew. Every word of Amos's sermon struck her like a lash. Behind her, the enslaved shifted uneasily. They too knew what sold down south meant. It was not punishment, it was erasure, a living death. To be sent there was to vanish from all memory, consumed by swamps and whips, harsher than anything Carolina knew. In the quarters, fear took root. Daniel avoided speaking of it, but the others did not. Some urged him to run into the swamps, to vanish before the men with ledgers came. Others warned him that running would doom the rest. Daniel himself said nothing, though his silence was heavy as iron. At night, he hammered longer than necessary, each strike of the mallet like a muted drumbeat of defiance. Then came the day of spectacle. The judge assembled them in the estate yard, family, overseer, servants, field hands. The sheriff, Miller, stood watch at the edge, his badge glinting in the sun, his face unreadable. Walter Reed, polished and preening, strutted with the arrogance of a man rehearsing ownership. He demanded a final humiliation, a ritual to seal the judge's plan. "Beg pardon before the lady," Walter ordered, gesturing at Eva. His voice carried across the yard, slicing through the buzz of cicadas. "Kneel, as you did before. Confess your insolence, and perhaps mercy will soften your chains." Daniel stood tall, hands rough with soot, face unreadable. He did not bow. The silence thickened until it choked. Cole, the overseer, smirked, whip in hand, eager for spectacle. Then Eva moved. Her breath was ragged, her gloved hands trembling. For weeks she had endured whispers, for months she had borne the weight of shame. Now, with the crowd staring and Walter sneering, she lifted her chin. Her voice cracked, but the words rang like hammer against anvil. "The child is Daniel's." The yard erupted, shouts, gasps, curses. Women clutched pearls, men spat oaths. Walter staggered as if struck, his vanity sliced to ribbons in an instant. Cole swore and raised his whip, but the judge's voice thundered above them all. "Silence!" Eva pressed on, her words tumbling now like stones loosed from a cliff. She named Daniel as father before witnesses, tearing the veil from her secret. And more, her voice steadied as she declared that the judge's ledgers were false, that entries had been altered to conceal debts and profits, that documents proving Daniel's forced sale had been forged. Her confession became accusation, striking at the very heart of her father's authority. The crowd's roar was deafening. The sheriff stepped forward, not to punish Ava, but to seize Daniel for his own safety, he said, though no one believed it. Walter raged, Eva trembled, the judge's face darkened with fury. The order, so carefully constructed, had been ripped wide open, and truth poured into the light like fire through dry cane. That day, masks slipped from every face. The overseer showed his thirst for blood, Walter his cowardice, the judge his corruption, and Ava, once the obedient heiress, revealed herself as rebel against silence. And Daniel Walker, silent blacksmith, stood at the center of it all, the coal inside him flaring at last. The yard did not forget. For days after Eva Hart's declaration, the air of Fairwater throbbed with tension, as if the soil itself waited for thunder. The scandal spread beyond the estate walls. At the market, whispers tangled with the smell of molasses and saltfish. The judge's daughter had spoken a slave's name in front of white witnesses. At the courthouse steps, men shook their heads and muttered of shame. Even in Charleston parlors, the story traveled faster than steamboats. Hart's line is ruined, they said. The daughter is soiled, the judge undone, the fiancé disgraced. In the yard, the consequences hardened. Sheriff Miller, a broad man with a scar across his jaw, took Daniel into custody. Not the courthouse jail that would have meant record. Instead, he locked him in the carriage house, claiming it was for safety. His eyes, when they met Daniel's, were not cruel but cautious. The sheriff was no friend. He was a man measuring risk. To keep Daniel alive was to preserve order, but to keep him too long was to invite chaos. Ava Hart, pale and trembling, did not retreat. On the following day, she gathered her courage and entered the estate office, demanding to write a statement. In front of servants, clerks, and even her father's attorney, she set her words on paper, naming Daniel Walker as the father of her child. She did more. With a steady hand, she exposed the judge's ledgers, debts disguised as profits, land falsely claimed, records of sale that proved Daniel was being driven toward the river, not by law but by corruption. Her voice, weak at first, grew sharp as steel. Witnesses stood frozen, their pens trembling, unable to erase what they had heard. News of her defiance rippled outward. Some called it madness, others courage, still others the poison of hysteria. But in the courthouse square, young attorney Mr. Piker Mann, not yet 30, unscarred by long service to the planter class, offered his hand. He swore to carry Ava's documents north to the press, to let the scandal bleed into print. If truth is to be buried here, he told her, then let it be resurrected in ink. The judge raged like a man possessed. He stripped Ava of her dowry, casting her from Fairwater with only her dresses and shame. Walter Reed, humiliated, broke the engagement in public, sneering that he had been deceived. His vanity could not survive scandal. Overseer Cole, whose whip had always cracked in Hart's name, vanished without farewell. Some said he fled to Florida, fearing the collapse of the house he served. Others claimed the swamp swallowed him whole. And Daniel, he remained in the carriage house, wrists bound, waiting. His silence was heavier than chains. Each night he listened to the marsh winds rattle the shutters, each gust carrying scents of salt, mud, and freedom. Yet in the shadows of the estate, resistance stirred. House servants, long invisible, began to move with purpose. An old cook slipped him bread hidden under a cloth. A boy who fetched water lingered long enough to whisper news of the yard. And one night, when the moon lay low and the crickets screamed, a woman pressed a small iron key into his palm. "Use it when the tide turns," she whispered. By dawn, the plan was shaped. At the edge of the estate, where reeds grew thick and the air smelled of brine, a boat waited. Not a grand vessel, but a fisherman's sloop hidden beneath low branches, prepared by hands who risked everything for silence to be broken. The path through the marshes was treacherous mud that swallowed boots, insects that rose in clouds, waters that mirrored the moon, until friend and foe alike looked like shadows. But it was the only road out. On the final night, the estate lay restless. Judge Hart drank deep into his study, candles guttering against stacks of forged ledgers. Ava was already gone, sent off in disgrace to Charleston. Walter's laughter no longer haunted the halls. He had retreated to his family's land, licking his wounds. Cole's whip no longer cracked. The yard was quieter without it. The order of Fairwater, built over decades, sagged like a house with rotten beams. Daniel waited until the midnight hour, when even the dogs lay still. He slipped the key into the lock, the iron turning with a sound soft as breath. He stepped into the night, shackles left behind on the floor. His body, scarred and weary, moved with the steadiness of a man carrying more than himself. Through the reeds he walked, each step sinking into mud, each insect sting ignored. The marsh hummed with life, frogs croaking, herons shifting, the tide skiing at roots. Behind him, the estate lights burned dim. Before him, the sloop rocked gently in shadow. Two figures waited there, men of the river, silent, their faces half hidden. They gave no names, asked no questions. One lifted a hand, beckoning. Daniel stepped into the boat. The oars dipped. The reeds closed behind them. By morning, the estate discovered absence. The carriage house stood empty, the lock hanging loose, the bed of straw cold. Sheriff Miller muttered of negligence. The judge thundered of betrayal. Rumors churned. The marsh had swallowed him. Abolitionists had stolen him. Spirits had carried him away. None could agree, but all knew. Daniel Walker was gone. Ava was cast out, her name a curse at every planter's table. Walter Reed's pride collapsed, his inheritance dimmed by shame. Judge Hart clutched at ledgers now tainted with suspicion. Overseer Cole had vanished into the dark, and across the marshes, carried by tide and oar, the blacksmith who once knelt on marble vanished into the horizon. Fairwater never returned to silence. What Eva Hart confessed in the yard could not be buried, no matter how hard Judge Hart tried to nail the truth shut beneath law and ledger. In town, the story became known as the Hart Scandal. At markets, women whispered it between baskets of rice and beans. At taverns, men muttered it over mugs of bitter ale. At the courthouse, clerks retold it with relish, how the judge's daughter had defied her father, how Walter Reed's vanity had been split open, how the overseer fled, how the blacksmith vanished like smoke over the marsh. In Charleston, the press hinted at corruption, publishing fragments of ledgers smuggled north by young Pike. The judge thundered that it was forgery, but doubt hung heavy. Invitations to his house dwindled. Men who once clapped him on the back now crossed the street to avoid his gaze. The pillars of his reputation cracked, though the house itself still stood. Ava lived in exile. Charleston parlors received her politely, but behind closed doors she was a ghost at every table, a warning dressed in silk. Some said she gave birth quietly and faded into obscurity. Others whispered she raised her child with stern resolve, never speaking her lover's name, but never denying it either. To some she was ruined. To others she was the first voice to say aloud what everyone knew, but no one dared confess, that even in Carolina, blood and power could not forever silence truth. And what of Daniel Walker? The marsh gave no testimony. Some swore he drowned, swallowed by reeds and tide. Others claimed he boarded a fisherman's sloop and sailed toward Beaufort. By autumn, whispers arose. A free carpenter had been seen there, a man with scarred hands, sculled in both iron and wood. He worked quietly, rebuilt houses burned by storms, repaired tools for neighbors. He was said to raise a boy named Henry Bright-Eyed, strong, carrying in his jaw the shadow of the Hart family, and in his shoulders the weight of freedom. No record confirmed it, but whispers are harder to quell than men. At Fairwater, Judge Hart lived long enough to see his house shrink in power. Walter Reed never regained his pride. Overseer Cole was never found. The scandal became legend, retold not in ledgers, but in murmurs, in warning, in memory. And through those murmurs, Daniel Walker endured not as property, not as victim, but as symbol. To some he was danger, to others deliverance. To those who still bent beneath chains, his name was spoken low, like a prayer or a promise. Because the lesson of Fairwater was not simply that a blacksmith escaped, or that an heiress fell, or that a judge's mask cracked. It was that even the most carefully constructed order, the chandeliers, the ledgers, the sermons, the whips, could collapse when the truth was spoken aloud. And so the story lingered, carried on the salt air, etched into memory like a scar. Daniel Walker, who once knelt on marble but rose through reeds, who turned humiliation into survival, and whose silence burned hotter than iron.